She grew up in a house where the FBI sat outside in parked cars, and the phone might be tapped. Her father's name was in every newspaper for 20 years. She watched him go to prison, and she was at his side when he died. But the story of Victoria Gotti isn't just the story of being John Gotti's daughter. It's the story of a woman who fell in love with a man her famous and dangerous father specifically did not want her to marry, and married him anyway, and then spent 19 years inside a marriage that turned out to be everything her father had tried to warn her about. The real story is more complicated than the tabloid version, and the part most people have never heard is where it actually begins, in a high school in Queens, with a girl who just wanted to be ordinary. Howard Beach and a childhood in the shadow of everything. Victoria Gotti was born on November 8, 1962, in Brooklyn, New York, the first of John and Victoria DiGiorgio Gotti's 5 children, the only daughter among 4 brothers. She came into a household that was, from the outside, a modest working-class Italian-American family in the specific world of Howard Beach, Queens, a neighborhood with deep roots in the Italian immigrant community, a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's family and where the rhythms of life were organized around church, school, extended family, and the specific code of the street that nobody talked about but everyone understood. Howard Beach, in the early 1960s, was a particular world. It sat in the southwestern corner of Queens, bounded by Jamaica Bay and the Belt Parkway, the kind of neighborhood where the same families had lived for generations and where your name was already known before you walked in the door. The Italian-American community that had built itself there across decades of immigration and assimilation maintained its specific social codes with the consistency of people who understood that the codes were the infrastructure of everything else. The trust networks, the business relationships, the mutual protection that organized life in a world that was always, to some degree, operating outside the frameworks the wider society officially endorsed. From the inside, the Gotti household was already something more complicated than it appeared from the street. John Gotti was, in 1962, not yet the Dapper Don or the Teflon Don or any of the other names the newspapers would eventually give him. He was a young man with a criminal history and a place in the hierarchy of the Gambino crime family that was growing but had not yet reached anything like its eventual peak. The family lived in the kind of modest circumstances that Italian-American families of that neighborhood and era inhabited. A 2-story house, old-fashioned family values, the specific working-class dignity of people who kept their homes clean and their children fed and their business private. Victoria was, by her own account, the quiet one, the shy one. She was so quiet in her early childhood that her parents genuinely worried about her development for a period. She describes them having suspected she might be autistic, based on how withdrawn and uncommunicative she was compared to the boys around her. She was not autistic. She was simply a girl who preferred to observe rather than to perform, who internalized rather than externalized, who was building an interior life while the exterior one was still waiting for the right material. She attended St. Helens Catholic School in Howard Beach, then Franklin K. Lane High School in Brooklyn. The Catholic school trajectory was typical for the Italian-American families of her world, and the education it provided was both academically solid and socially formative. The same classmates, the same priests and nuns, the same families moving through the same institutions across years that built the specific kind of community solidarity that the neighborhood valued. She was doing what the daughters of that world were expected to do, attending the right institutions, associating with the right people, developing toward the right kind of life. Her father's world was always present in the household, even when it wasn't visible. The FBI surveillance of John Gotti was a fact of life for the whole family well before his arrest and trial years. The awareness that the household was being watched, that the phone calls might not be private, that the men in the car down the street were not neighbors, was the atmospheric condition of the Gotti children's upbringing, the specific background radiation of a life organized in proximity to serious organized crime. You grew up knowing things that you did not discuss. You grew up understanding that there were two versions of the world, the version that other people saw and the version that was real, and that navigating between them required a specific and permanent vigilance. Victoria navigated it by retreating further inward. She read. She wrote. She developed the skills of observation and narrative that would eventually make her a writer. First, a newspaper columnist, then a novelist, then a memoirist. The girl who was too quiet to be understood was actually watching everything, absorbing everything, storing it all for a later use she could not yet fully describe. And then she met Carmine Agnello. Carmine Agnello, the boy from the neighborhood. Carmine Agnello was born in 1960 in Ozone Park, Queens. The same general world as the Gottis, the same Italian-American community, the same neighborhood networks and social codes that organized life in that part of the borough. Ozone Park and Howard Beach were adjacent neighborhoods with overlapping worlds. The families knew each other, the kids went to the same schools or the rival ones, the church communities and the street communities intersected in ways that made the geography of the two neighborhoods feel like a single extended space. He was 2 years older than Victoria, and he had grown up in the specific context of the streets of Queens, navigating the same world that produced the Gambino family and many of the people associated with it. His own trajectory was already moving toward the criminal world by the time he and Victoria encountered each other in their high school years, not yet fully formed as a criminal enterprise, but already oriented in that direction, in the way that young men in those neighborhoods, who had certain qualities and certain connections, tended to orient. He would become, in law enforcement terminology, a made member of the Gambino crime family, a formal status that meant specific obligations and specific exposure to the federal prosecutions that were already, by the late 1980s, systematically dismantling the New York organized crime world. He was her first real boyfriend. Victoria has described him this way herself, with the specific precision that characterizes how she tends to speak about the Carmine years, not romanticizing what it was, but acknowledging that it was first, and that first has a weight that subsequent experience doesn't diminish. She was not someone who had a series of high school relationships leading up to him. He was the one who got there first, in the specific and formative sense. What she saw in him in the high school years when they first encountered each other is the specific combination of qualities that women who grow up in neighborhoods like that, one tend to recognize. He was physically imposing. The nickname "the Bull" that law enforcement would eventually give him suited something that was already visible in how he carried himself. He was confident in the way of someone who had figured out how his world worked, and he was attentive to her in a way that made the quiet, overlooked girl feel specifically and importantly seen. He saw her. In a household where she was the girl surrounded by brothers, in a neighborhood where the girls were measured by specific criteria that the quiet observer didn't always meet, Carmine Agnello paid attention to her. There was something that happened between them before the marriage that matters to the whole story. According to testimony given in 2007 federal court proceedings in approximately 1979, when Victoria would have been about 17 and Carmine about 19, Carmine Agnello committed an assault against her. Her father, John Gotti, found out about it. John Gotti's response was not a call to the police. It was the response of a man who operated entirely within the rules of the world he had built his life in. Several Gambino associates ambushed Carmine Agnello, beat him with a baseball bat, and shot him in the buttocks. It was a message, delivered in the specific language that Gotti spoke when a message needed to be sent. Carmine would understand what the message meant. He would understand who sent it and why. And he would understand that this was not an invitation for the relationship with Gotti's daughter to continue. Victoria continued the relationship anyway. The specific dynamic here, a daughter defying her father over a man her father has specifically demonstrated his opposition to in the most dramatic possible way, is not simple, and Victoria Gotti has not pretended it is simple. She has spoken about this period with the complexity it deserves, acknowledging the defiance, acknowledging what the warning was, acknowledging that she chose to discount it in favor of what she felt. She was young. She was in love with the first person who had ever made her feel genuinely seen. She believed, in the way that young women in love believe, that what she knew about Carmine was more important than what her father had tried to demonstrate about him. The tragedy is that she was not entirely wrong about either thing. The marriage her father didn't want. Victoria Gotti and Carmine Agnello were married in 1984, 22 and 24 years old respectively, with a history that already included the specific episode her father had responded to so dramatically 5 years earlier. The wedding took place over John Gotti's stated objections. Victoria's parents were against the marriage and said so clearly. Carmine's connections to the criminal world, his existing history with organized crime, and the specific episode of 1979 all gave the Gotti family reasons to oppose the union that went beyond the ordinary parental preference for a better match. There is something worth understanding about what it meant for Victoria to go through with this marriage against her father's expressed opposition. John Gotti was, by 1984, not simply a disapproving father in the conventional sense. He was a figure of genuine power in the Gambino organization, about to become its boss within the next year, a man whose word carried weight that extended far beyond the family dinner table. His opposition to a marriage was not the ordinary paternal reluctance of a man who simply doesn't like his daughter's choice. It was the expressed opposition of someone who had already sent a violent physical message about that choice, and who was now opposing it in the clearest possible terms. Victoria went forward, and in doing so, she exercised the specific kind of autonomy that requires either real courage or real certainty or both. The willingness to look at everything her father knew and had done and was telling her, and to say that she understood it, and was doing this anyway. The early years of the marriage, before the legal troubles began to accumulate, had their genuine moments of normalcy and genuine warmth. They moved from the working-class world of Howard Beach toward the more comfortable world that Carmine's business income made available. They were building a family. The loss of Justine in May 1985 and the cancer diagnosis that followed it were devastating in ways that brought them together in the solidarity that shared grief can produce. And then the miracle of 3 more children, the sons who defied the medical prognosis and arrived across the next 5 years. Her son, Carmine Agnello Jr., was born in 1986, John in 1987, and Frank in 1990. The 3 boys she raised, often described as miracle babies, given the medical prognosis that had preceded them, became the primary organizing fact of her adult life in the Agnello years, and later the central subjects of the reality television series that would make her a public figure in her own right. Victoria was managing all of this while pursuing her writing career. She has spoken about the specific challenge of finding the time and the mental space to do creative work inside a demanding domestic life, alongside a husband whose world was generating its own constant noise. She found it. The columns got written. The books got published. The career was built. Both things ran simultaneously, which is what women in every generation have always been asked to make work. Her father's trajectory was running in the background of all of this. The acquittals in the late 1980s, the Teflon Don mythology, the 1992 conviction. Victoria watched all of it from a position that was simultaneously inside the family and outside the specific criminal world her father inhabited. She was his daughter. She was not a participant in his enterprise. The distinction mattered to her, and she has maintained it consistently in everything she has said publicly about her father's life and death. The distinction also had a cost. The public never quite believed it. The Gotti name guaranteed that every book she wrote, and every column she published, and every television appearance she made would be understood through the frame of who her father was, regardless of what the work itself contained. She built a career despite that. The career is real. She is still writing. She is still talking. She is still the specific kind of woman that the quiet girl in Howard Beach was always going to become. Someone who observed everything, stored it all, and eventually found the words for all of it, including the parts that were hardest to say. Living the life. Howard Beach to Old Westbury. The trajectory of Victoria Gotti's life with Carmine Agnello is a specific story about social mobility in the specific context of organized crime money. They started in the working-class world of Howard Beach that both of them had come from, and they eventually ended up in a mansion in Old Westbury, New York, Long Island's Gold Coast, the world of horse properties and circular driveways, and the specific architectural extravagance of people who have money and want it to be visible. The distance between Howard Beach and Old Westbury is not simply geographic. It is the distance between the world their parents had inhabited and the world that organized crime money made available to the generation that followed. The Old Westbury mansion became, years later, the primary set for Growing Up Gotti, the reality television series that Victoria would produce and star in on A&E from 2004 to 2005. But in the years when the marriage was still intact, it was simply where they lived. A large house, 3 boys, the specific domestic world that Victoria was managing, while Carmine's business world was running alongside it in the specific parallel structure that characterized life in that milieu. Victoria had always written. Even in the years of the early marriage and the children, she was pursuing the writing career that eventually became her professional identity. She began as a columnist for the New York Post, developing the specific voice, direct, emotionally honest, willing to engage with difficult material without flinching, that would characterize everything she wrote afterward. She eventually reported for Fox. She was doing journalism at a time when female columnists in New York were fighting for space, and she was getting it, which was not simply a function of who her father was. The writing was good enough to earn its own position. She published her first book, Women and Mitral Valve Prolapse, in 1995, a medical book co-written with a physician, addressing the heart condition that she had been diagnosed with and that affects women in disproportionate numbers. The book was a genuine contribution to public awareness about a health issue she understood personally, and it was not what anyone expected from the mob boss's daughter who had been writing for the Post. It was a signal that she was doing something real with her public platform, something that was genuinely useful to people who knew nothing about the Gotti name and didn't care. Her first novel, The Senator's Daughter, was published in 1996. A second novel, I'll Be Watching You, came out in 1999. The novels were well received enough to establish her as a working fiction writer with a real readership, not simply a celebrity with a book deal. She was building something that belonged to her. Meanwhile, her father's career was reaching its dramatic conclusion. John Gotti had been acquitted 3 times in the late 1980s, the acquittals that generated the Teflon Don nickname, that made him seem untouchable in a way that the press found irresistible. His 1992 conviction on murder and racketeering charges, which came in significant part through FBI wiretaps, and the cooperation of Gotti's former underboss Salvatore Gravano, ended the Teflon Don era definitively. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He died at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, in June 2002, of cancer of the head and neck that had progressed through years of imprisonment. Victoria was asked by the New York Post to write her father's obituary when he died. She wrote it. The article appeared in the paper on the same day as his funeral. The same day she was burying her father, she was also publishing a public account of who he was in the newspaper that had covered his crimes and his trials for 20 years. It is a specific kind of task, and the fact that she could do it, and that the Post asked her to do it, speaks to both the quality of her writing and the specific position she occupied at the intersection of private grief and public record. Carmine Agnello, From the Bull to Federal Prison. The legal story of Carmine Agnello, which was always running beneath the surface of the marriage, eventually became impossible to keep beneath the surface. His relationship with the Gambino crime family was not simply a matter of background and association. He was, by the late 1990s, a formally inducted member of the organization, a made man, in the specific terminology of the American Mafia, which meant specific obligations, specific protections, and specific exposures to the federal law enforcement activity that was, by then, systematically dismantling the New York organized crime families. The FBI and the Justice Department had, through the RICO statute, and through the cooperation of witnesses at every level of the Gambino hierarchy, built the investigative infrastructure to prosecute people like Carmine Agnello. The scrap metal business was real, in the sense that there was actually scrap metal being processed and sold. But it was also real in the sense that it was a vehicle for the kind of financial activity and criminal enterprise that eventually attracted serious federal attention. The business generated income that was not fully accounted for. The business relationships were not always with legitimate partners, and the people who ran the business were not people the federal government was looking at casually. In February 1994, Agnello was charged with criminal mischief for damaging a police scooter outside his scrapyard. The episode was straightforward in its facts. A police officer was issuing parking tickets to cars outside the yard, and Agnello physically damaged the scooter. It was a minor charge, the kind of thing that, in a different context, would be a footnote. But it was a visible instance of someone who had spent his life operating in a world where authority was something to manage rather than to simply accept, responding to the ordinary exercise of that authority with destruction. The larger legal problems arrived in 2000. Agnello was arrested on charges of extortion and arson. The charges were substantial, supported by evidence developed over time by federal investigators. The prosecution outlined a pattern of criminal conduct that went beyond isolated incidents, a pattern of using intimidation and force in the conduct of his business affairs in ways that constituted organized crime activity. He was convicted in 2001, sentenced to 9 years in federal prison, and ordered to pay $950,000 in restitution. Victoria had, during the period leading up to the conviction, done what women in her world were expected to do. She stood by her husband. She posted bail using royalties from her books and whatever other assets she could access. She attended hearings. She maintained, publicly, the posture of a wife who was supporting her husband through legal difficulty. Whether her private assessment of the situation matched her public posture is something only she could know. But the infidelities were also a matter of record. Not a single episode that could be attributed to circumstances or opportunity, but a pattern. Multiple women, over time, a systematic reality that was eventually known to enough people to be beyond reasonable doubt. The infidelities represented a different kind of betrayal than the criminal activities, more personal, more specifically directed at Victoria as a woman, more clearly about who Carmine Agnello was in his private life than who he was in his criminal one. In 2003, while Carmine was incarcerated, Victoria filed for divorce. The legal grounds were constructive abandonment, a New York divorce law provision that applies when a couple has not had physical intimacy for more than a year, which in the case of a spouse in federal prison is essentially automatic as a matter of law. But the real reasons were the accumulated weight of everything the marriage had produced over 19 years, the criminal life running beneath the domestic one, the infidelities, the specific realization that the warning her father had delivered in 1979 in his particular way had been right. The divorce settlement was substantial. $12,500 per month in alimony, plus $12,500 per month for the children, for a total package estimated at approximately $7 million. It was an acknowledgement, in financial terms, of what 19 years inside the marriage had cost her. Growing Up. Gotti, the show that changed everything. In 2004, the year after the divorce was finalized, Victoria Gotti agreed to star in a reality television series for A&E. The show was called Growing Up Gotti, and it documented Victoria's life with her three teenage sons, Carmine Jr., John, and Frank, in the old Westbury mansion that had been the family home during the Agnello years. She was a recently divorced mother of three teenage boys, the daughter of the most famous mob boss in American history, and she was inviting cameras into her house. It was a calculated decision, not an impulsive one. The show ran from August 2004 until December 2005 and attracted audiences that were, by A&E's standards at the time, genuinely significant. At its peak viewership, it was drawing over 3 million viewers per episode, making it one of the network's most successful series of that period. What people were watching was not simply the spectacle of mob adjacency, though that element was clearly part of the appeal, and nobody involved in producing the show was naive about that. What they were watching was a particular kind of mother-son dynamic that was both specific to the Gotti world and also familiar in a more general way. The three sons, Carmine Jr., John, and Frank, were at the ages when teenage boys are most simultaneously infuriating and lovable, most visibly becoming who they were going to be as adults, most capable of generating the specific exasperated comedy that the show delivered. With their dark good looks and their Long Island confidence and the complicated inheritance of the name they carried, they became genuine television personalities in their own right. The show had a genuine warmth to it that its subject matter might not have suggested. Victoria's relationship with her sons, whatever its frustrations, was clearly a real and deep one, and that reality came through the cameras. Victoria emerged from the show as a public figure of considerable recognition. She became, in the specific cultural moment of the mid-2000s, someone whose face and name were known not just because of her father, but because of who she herself was. The mother, the writer, the woman who had survived the Agnello years and was raising three sons in a mansion, and was funny about it and honest about it, in ways that the reality television format occasionally actually rewards. The show was also, from Victoria's perspective, a calculated act of asserting control over a narrative that had always been told by other people. For decades, the Gotti story had been the property of federal prosecutors, of journalists, of filmmakers who were interested in organized crime as spectacle, and who had their own angles on the material. Victoria's angle. The angle of the woman who had grown up inside the story, who had married into the Gambino world deliberately, who had raised children in its shadow, who had watched her father be destroyed by the legal system while simultaneously loving him, was the angle that none of those other versions had contained. Growing up, Gotti was not a correction of the record. It was an assertion that the record was more complicated than anyone had previously acknowledged, and that the complexity was worth watching. Victoria Gotti, my father's daughter. In 2009, Victoria published This Family of Mine, What It Was Like Growing Up Gotti, a memoir that provided the most complete and personal account she had yet offered of what the Gotti household had actually been, what it had cost, and what it had meant. The book was direct and emotionally honest in ways that the reality show's format had not quite permitted, and it sold well enough to confirm that the audience for Victoria Gotti's specific voice extended beyond the viewers who had watched the A&E series. She described the specific experience of loving her father, genuinely as a daughter loves a father who is also genuinely present, while being aware of what he was and what his world produced. The father who came home from wherever he had been and was warm with his children was the same man the federal government was building cases against. The father who cried at the death of Victoria's stillborn daughter, Justine, was the same man who ordered the death of Paul Castellano. These were not two different people. They were the same man, and Victoria Gotti had spent her entire life holding both versions of him simultaneously. She described the specific psychology of growing up in a household where the public version and the private version of your family were radically different, where the FBI surveillance and the newspaper coverage and the trial coverage and the eventual conviction all coexisted with the specific ordinary texture of a father reading to his children, attending school events, being physically and emotionally present in ways that the public record of his crimes does not include, because it has no reason to. She was trying to give the full account, not the partial one. The memoir was that attempt. In 2019, she co-wrote and executive produced and narrated a lifetime biopic called Victoria Gotti, My Father's Daughter, a film that traced her life from childhood through the Carmine Agnello years and the divorce, organized around the central relationship between Victoria and her father. The actress Chelsea Fry portrayed Victoria in the film's dramatized sequences, while Victoria's own narration provided the perspective of the woman who had actually lived through everything depicted. The film received the kind of attention that anything involving the Gotti name reliably generates, but it also received credit for the emotional honesty of its approach, for the willingness to show conflict and difficulty alongside love, to portray a father-daughter relationship that was real in all its dimensions, rather than either romanticized or simply condemned. Victoria described the film, in interviews around its release, as an attempt to show a side of her father that was true, without pretending that all sides of him were equally good or equally deserving of celebration. Her father is gone. Carmine Agnello has been out of her life for decades, though not entirely out of her sons' lives, which is the specific ongoing complication of divorce when children are involved. He married again in 2008, a second wife named Danielle Vangar, with whom he had a son. He had additional legal troubles in 2017, convicted again on environmental violations and other charges. He paid and moved on. Victoria moved on long before he did. She is still writing. She is still talking about the family and the marriage and the world she came from in ways that are honest about all of it. She is still the specific kind of woman that the quiet girl in Howard Beach was always going to become. Someone who observed everything and stored it all and eventually found the words. What it actually cost and what she built. Victoria Gotti is a woman who has spent her entire adult life navigating the specific cost of being born into one Gambino family story and choosing to marry into another. The cost of the Gotti name has been real and ongoing, and not always of her own making. Her father's conviction and imprisonment defined the family's public identity for decades. Her brother John Jr.'s subsequent involvement in the Gambino organization and his own legal troubles, he became acting boss after their father's imprisonment in 1992, was arrested in 1998 on racketeering and extortion charges, and navigated a series of trials that eventually produced a guilty plea in 2009, added additional layers of public scrutiny to the family. Her brother, Peter Gotti, also faced federal prosecution. The family became, in the specific cultural landscape of the 1990s and 2000s, a multi-generational story about organized crime that the press covered with the sustained attention of something that never ran out of new material. The cost of the Agnello marriage was its own specific accounting, separate from the Gotti family account. 19 years of managing a household while the legal exposure built beneath it. The stillborn daughter in May 1985, and the cancer discovered in its immediate aftermath. Doctors telling her she would likely not have more children, and then 3 more children, defying the prognosis across the next 5 years. 3 boys who were miracle babies in the most literal sense, children whose existence required the specific combination of her determination and whatever medical factors allowed the pregnancies to succeed against the odds that had been named. The infidelities were real, and they were documented, and they were a pattern, not an incident. Multiple women across years of a marriage. Victoria has spoken about this in interviews with the specific, carefully controlled anger of someone who has processed the experience enough to describe it without performing it. The anger is present, but it is held, not displayed, in the way of someone who has decided that the person who betrayed her does not get to continue consuming her emotional energy. She gave 19 years to the marriage. She raised 3 sons. She wrote books and built a career alongside all of it. She did not receive the faithfulness that those investments deserved. She filed for divorce. She received a settlement. She moved forward. The Growing Up Gotti show ran its course and gave her sons a platform and gave her a public identity that was partly her own rather than entirely her father's. The 2009 memoir gave her the chance to tell the full story in her own voice. The 2019 Lifetime biopic gave her the chance to shape the cinematic version of that story. To be, finally, the author of the Gotti narrative, rather than simply one of its subjects. Her sons grew up. Carmine Jr., John, and Frank became young men navigating their own relationships to the family history, their grandfather's name, their father's imprisonment and eventual release. The specific inheritance of being a Gotti Agnello in a world that had very strong and very predetermined opinions about what that meant. They had their own lives. They built them. Victoria watched. She became a grandmother. The girl from Howard Beach, who was too quiet for anyone to understand, who fell in love with the first boy who made her feel seen, who married him against her father's specific and violent objection, who spent 19 years inside the marriage that followed, who wrote books and raised sons and attended trials and buried her father and divorced her husband and then put a camera crew in her house. She became a grandmother, which is a way of saying that the story continued, as stories do, past the most dramatic chapters. Her father is gone. Carmine Agnello has been out of her life for decades, though not entirely out of her sons' lives, which is the specific ongoing complication of divorce when children are involved. He married again in 2008, a second wife named Danielle Vangar, with whom he had a son. He had additional legal troubles in 2017, convicted again on environmental violations and other charges. He paid and moved on. Victoria moved on long before he did. What the Gambino family marriage ultimately made her was not a mafia princess in the romanticized version of that phrase. It made her someone who had been inside one of the most closely watched family stories in American crime history, twice, once through birth and once through marriage, and had come out the other side with a clear-eyed account of what she had found. The clear-eyed account is not a glorification. Victoria Gotti has never pretended that the world her father and her husband inhabited was something other than what it was. She has watched the cost accumulate across her entire lifetime. Her brother's imprisonment, her father's death in federal custody, the 19 years of her own marriage and its dismantling, the specific ongoing complexity of raising sons inside the shadow of a family history that the world has strong opinions about. She knows what it cost. She has paid most of it herself. The account is also not a condemnation. She loved her father. She married Carmine Agnello because she genuinely loved him, because he was the first person who had made her feel seen, because the love was real, even when the marriage was not what it needed to be. The love and the cost coexisted, as they always do in real lives, and she has been honest about both. She is still writing, she is still talking. She is still the specific kind of woman that the quiet girl in Howard Beach was always going to become. Someone who observed everything, stored it all, and eventually found the words for all of it, including the parts that were hardest to say. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. Every night for 30 years, he walked out from behind that curtain and made America feel like everything was going to be fine. He was charming and quick and warm, the most trusted face on American television, the man you ended the day with. He seemed, to the millions of people who watched him, like someone who had figured everything out. But there was a version of Johnny Carson that the cameras never caught, a version that his four wives knew well, that they describe in interviews and in the detailed accounts of the biography published after his death, with words like scared and rampage and two different people. He married 4 times. 4 women said yes to this man the whole world loved. Each of them eventually walked away. The story of why tells you something about Johnny Carson that 30 years of The Tonight Show never did. Norfolk, Nebraska, and the man who was always performing. Before the marriages, before The Tonight Show, before any of it, there was the boy in Nebraska. John William Carson was born on October 23rd, 1925, in Corning, Iowa, the second of 3 children of Homer. Kit Carson and Ruth Hook Carson. His father worked for a power company. Stable work, practical work, the kind of work that middle American families of the 1930s built their modest lives around. When Johnny was 8, the family moved to Norfolk, Nebraska, and it was in Norfolk, in the specific atmosphere of that small prairie city, with its churches and its local businesses and its culture of practicality and restraint, that the essential shape of who he would become was formed. The Great Plains culture of the 1930s and 1940s was not a culture that encouraged emotional expression. The men of that world were not men who said what they felt or examined what drove them. They worked, they provided, they maintained. The specific emotional reticence that became Johnny Carson's most defining personal characteristic, the wall behind the charm, the privacy behind the warmth, the fundamental inaccessibility behind the apparent openness, was not simply his nature. It was the air he breathed growing up. He was performing magic tricks for neighbors at 14, having taught himself from an instruction book and discovering immediately the specific pleasure of holding a room's attention, of knowing that the people watching were responding to what he chose to do. He was doing a local radio program in Norfolk at 17, already demonstrating the instinct for an audience that would define the next 6 decades of his life. He was, even as a teenager, considerably better at addressing a room than he was at sitting quietly with the person closest to him. The distance between the public performance and the private connection was built into him early, and it would structure everything that followed. He served in the United States Navy toward the end of World War II aboard the USS Pennsylvania in the Pacific, and returned to the University of Nebraska after the service to complete his degree in radio and speech. He graduated in 1949. He was 23 years old and already entirely oriented toward the career he was going to build. There was never a period of uncertainty about what he was going to do with his life. The question was only how quickly he was going to do it. It was at Nebraska, in those years, that he met the woman he would marry first. Her name was Joan Marill Wolcott, and everyone called her Jody. Jody Wolcott, the first wife and the first pattern. Jody Marill Wolcott was a student at the University of Nebraska when she met Johnny Carson, and by all accounts she was a woman of real energy and personality, someone whose vivacity matched Carson's in a way that made the attraction immediate and the early relationship genuinely exciting. They were both young, both talented, both operating in the specific world of post-war American optimism that believed the future was large and available to anyone who reached for it hard enough. They married in October 1949 in North Platte, Nebraska, the year Johnny graduated. He had already landed a job as a radio announcer at WOW in Omaha, and the career was clearly heading somewhere specific. The marriage began with the specific momentum of two young people who believed in each other's potential and who had not yet discovered what the potential would cost. The early years required the family to move repeatedly as Carson's career advanced, from Omaha radio to Los Angeles television in 1951, where he got a local television comedy show and began to develop the specific comedic and interview skills that would eventually make him national. Then to the national stage of Who Do You Trust?, the daytime game show that he hosted from 1957 to 1962, and that established him as a nationally recognized television personality. 3 sons arrived across the early years of the marriage: Christopher in 1950, Richard in 1952, and Corey in 1953. By the time Corey was born, Johnny and Jody had been married 4 years and were already navigating the specific pressures of a career that was consuming an increasing share of what the marriage needed. Jody was managing 3 young boys and the household, while Johnny was working the demanding schedule of a rising television personality. The moves were her problem as much as his. The disruptions to any settled domestic life were hers to manage. The specific inequality of that arrangement, his career always the primary consideration, her needs always the secondary one, was not unusual for the era, but it created the specific resentments that the era's expectations didn't provide much space to address. What the biography Carson the Magnificent, written by Bill Zamey and completed by Mike Thomas after Zamey's death in 2023, published in 2024, documents about the marriage to Jody, is the most candid account yet published of what the private Carson looked like in those years. The picture is not comfortable. Alcohol was at the center of the problem. Carson had a low tolerance for it. He was not a man who became relaxed and genial after a few drinks, the way the social culture of the era expected men to become. He became instead someone else. The anger that the sober Carson managed with the specific control of someone who had learned early that emotions were not for public display came out sideways when he drank, in rages that the people around him found alarming, and that the next morning he would not fully remember. The marriage became a household organized around the specific anxiety of not knowing which version of Carson was going to come home. The sober Carson was warm and funny and capable of genuine tenderness. The drunk Carson came home at 3 in the morning and tore the sheets off the bed while Jody was sleeping, shouting that he was working his life away while she was doing nothing. Jody was not simply a passive figure in the dynamic. The biography describes a marriage where both parties acted out, where she would flirt with other men at parties in ways designed to provoke him, where the drinking and the provocations and the explosions formed a cycle that neither of them was able or willing to break. There were infidelities on both sides. There were scenes in front of other couples that left the witnesses deeply uncomfortable. The 2024 biography describes boozy rows, aplenty, and long silent periods of resentment and shame, each party capable of making things worse in their own specific ways. Carson's own account of his relationship with alcohol, offered candidly in a 1979 60 Minutes interview with Mike Wallace, described discovering that he simply did not drink well. That while other people became happy and sociable and affectionate when they drank, he did exactly the opposite. The change happened, he said, before he could stop it. The self-knowledge was real. The behavior change that the self-knowledge was supposed to produce did not come until much later. They divorced in 1963, after 14 years and 3 children. Carson was 37 years old and was about to become the most powerful man in American entertainment. And in the same year the divorce was finalized, he married someone new. Joanne Copeland, the second wife and the show that ate everything. Joanne Copeland was working as a stewardess for Pan American World Airways when she and Carson had their first date in 1960. She was, by the accounts of people who knew the couple, a striking and intelligent woman who had built her own life and career before meeting Carson. Someone who brought a quality of glamour and self-possession to his world at a moment when the specific social world of a rising television personality required exactly that kind of partner. She was also, as it turned out, someone who understood the entertainment industry in ways that made her a genuine professional partner as well as a wife. When Johnny Carson was offered the job of hosting The Tonight Show in 1962, after Jack Parr's departure, the decision was not obvious. The role was enormous. The expectations were enormous. The potential for failure, taking over from a beloved and distinctive predecessor, doing so under the scrutiny of the entire television industry, was equally enormous. Some people around Carson advised caution. Joanne encouraged him directly and specifically to take it. She told him it was the right opportunity and the right time, and that he should accept. He did. They married on August 17th, 1963, in a ceremony that was essentially a surprise. There was no advance announcement, and the news reached the press only after the wedding had taken place. It was the same year his divorce from Jody was finalized. He had replicated the timing of the first marriage's beginning, which had also coincided with the urgency of a career moment. Married just before or just after a major professional transition, the personal and professional woven together in ways that left very little space between them. The first years of the marriage were years of extraordinary professional success and private difficulty. The Tonight Show was running from NBC's studios in New York, and Carson's preparation for it consumed enormous amounts of his time and energy. 5 nights a week, the performance required everything he had. The research required hours of reading before each taping. The social obligations that the show generated, the industry relationships that needed maintaining, the talent that needed cultivating, consumed hours more. And what was left for the marriage was not always sufficient. The drinking pattern from the first marriage had not changed. Joanne Copeland's account of what it looked like from the inside is one of the most direct and specific descriptions of Carson's private behavior that any of his wives provided. She described the experience of living with 2 completely different people: the sober Carson, who was warm and funny and engaged, and the drunk Carson, who became a tiger. He had a low tolerance, she told the biographer. He had blackouts. He would come home in the early hours after whatever had happened after the taping and pull the sheets off the bed while she was sleeping, furious that he was working his life away while she slept. The anger had a quality that she named directly. He had a tremendous anger about women that would come out when he was drinking. Not a specific anger at her, a general anger at women as a category, that the sober Carson contained effectively, and that the drunk Carson could not. She could not explain where it came from. She was not in a position to explain it. She could only describe what it looked like from where she was standing. He would be remorseful the following day, remorseful and embarrassed, and genuinely sorry, by all accounts. And then the cycle would begin again, because the remorse, however genuine, was not the same as change. The marriage lasted 9 years, ending in divorce in 1972. The settlement that the court ordered was $6,000 per month in alimony, to continue until Joanne remarried or until Carson died. Neither condition was met while the other was available. She never remarried. Carson died in 2005. She collected that monthly payment for 33 years after the divorce, an arrangement that outlasted all his subsequent marriages and became, in its way, the longest relationship he had with any of the 4 women. The same year the second divorce was finalized, Carson married someone new again. Joanna Holland, the third wife and the most expensive divorce. Joanna Holland was a model when she met Johnny Carson in 1971 at the 21 Club in New York, the famous Manhattan restaurant that was, in the early 1970s, one of the central social gathering places of the world that The Tonight Show occupied. He recalled later, in a People magazine interview, that he was openly flirting with her when they first encountered each other, and that the attraction was immediate and mutual. She was striking and self-possessed, a woman who had built her own life before she encountered Carson, and who had a son, Joe Holland, from a previous relationship. The family they formed together included Joe, whose presence in the household was one of the more uncomplicated dimensions of what turned out to be a deeply complicated marriage. They married in 1972, the same year Carson's divorce from Joanne Copeland was finalized. The pattern that had defined his approach to romantic transitions was holding firm. The new relationship began before the old one had fully resolved. The new marriage was in place before the wound of the previous one could close, and the specific urgency of the career transition. The Tonight Show was moving from New York to Los Angeles in 1972, which was an enormous practical disruption as well as a professional relocation, was running simultaneously with the personal one. The early years of the marriage were spent navigating the move to California, the establishment of a new domestic life in a new city, and the continuing demands of the show. They lived well. A house in Bel Air, the social world of Los Angeles in the 1970s. The specific glamour of being the wife of the most powerful man in American entertainment. Joanna was photographed at the right events, in the right clothes, and was, by all accounts, genuinely beautiful in the specific way of someone who had built a modeling career on her appearance, and who had not let that appearance slide. But the drinking pattern was still present. Joanna's account, documented in the 2024 biography and in her earlier interview with Mike Wallace for 60 Minutes, describes the same fundamental dynamic that both Jody and Joanne had described before her. The experience of going out with one person and coming home with someone whose temperament was completely different. She described those black drunk episodes as frightening. She described the unpredictability of whatever could set him off. She used the word scared. In 1982, Carson was arrested for driving over the legal limit. He pled no contest to a misdemeanor charge. He was fined $603 and placed on 3 years of probation. The arrest became public news, as it inevitably would given who he was, and the gap between the trusted, controlled public image and the private reality was briefly and uncomfortably visible. The marriage had already been deteriorating for years by the time the divorce was finalized in 1985. Joanna initially requested $220,000 per month in alimony. The final settlement she received included $35,000 monthly plus $2 million in cash, multiple luxury cars, the Bel Air house, a New York apartment, and a Picasso painting. A total value reported at over $20 million. It was, and was widely described as, one of the most significant celebrity divorce settlements of its era. Joanna used the resources the settlement provided to reinvent herself. She became a Broadway producer, moved into philanthropic work, and built a professional life outside the shadow of the marriage. She was not, in other words, defined permanently by having been Johnny Carson's third wife. She found her own path. She died in July 2025 at an advanced age, having outlived her famous ex-husband by 2 decades. The pattern that 3 wives named. 3 marriages, 3 divorces. 3 women who had lived inside the specific private reality of Johnny Carson and who, when eventually given the opportunity to describe what they had found there, described versions of the same thing. The drinking was the headline, but the drinking was not quite the whole story. The drinking was the mechanism through which something deeper expressed itself, an anger that Carson himself acknowledged having, an anger specifically directed at women that the sober and controlled version of himself managed effectively and that the drunk version could not contain. Where the anger came from is something no one has definitively answered. The 2024 biography does not provide a tidy psychological explanation for it. The culture Carson grew up in did not encourage the kind of self-examination that might have produced an explanation. He managed it, rather than understood it, for most of his life. And the management worked until the alcohol turned the management off. Joanne Copeland named it most directly, a tremendous anger about women. Not about her specifically, about the category. Whatever had produced that anger in the boy from Norfolk, Nebraska, the specific configuration of his family, the specific culture of emotional repression he had grown up in, the specific dynamics of the first marriage. It was present in the second marriage and the third marriage with a consistency that rules out the possibility that it was simply situational. What is most revealing about the pattern is not the divorce itself, but the repetition. The same underlying dynamic expressing itself in 3 consecutive marriages with the same basic structure. The initial attraction and genuine warmth, the escalating drinking-related episodes, the moments of genuine fear described by women who were not prone to exaggeration, and eventually the ending. The biographies and interviews across the decades describe women who came in believing they had found the warm, funny, trusted public Carson, and who discovered, at varying speeds, that there was considerably more to what they had taken on than the screen had prepared them for. Carson addressed it himself, in the most honest terms he used about his marriages. In the observation he offered to People magazine that if he had given as much to marriage as he gave to The Tonight Show, he probably would have had a hell of a marriage. It is a statement that is both honest and incomplete. The show was competing with the marriages for his time and attention, genuinely. But something else was competing with the marriages too. The specific emotional unavailability of a man who was constitutionally more comfortable in front of an audience than in a kitchen, more comfortable delivering a performance than sustaining a relationship. The show gave him the structure in which his most available and most functional self could operate. The marriages required a different kind of availability that he had not learned to provide, and did not learn to provide until the fourth one. He stopped drinking significantly at some point before the fourth marriage. The specific timing is not publicly documented with precision, but the fourth marriage's absence of the pattern that defined the first three is consistent with someone who had made a fundamental change. He also, by 1987, had been through enough to understand something about what the marriages had cost and what had caused the costs. Whether he sought formal treatment or simply arrived at the change through the specific accumulation of consequences, the result was visible. Alexis Maas lived with a different version of Johnny Carson than Jodie Woolcott, Joanne Copeland, or Joanna Holland had lived with. The tragedy of the first three marriages is not simply that they ended. It is that they ended for a specific and addressable reason that Carson was not able to address until his 60s. Three women experienced the consequences of a problem that he eventually solved. They had already left by then. What Carson finally figured out, not just about the drinking, but about the specific relationship between his public self and his private one, between the warmth he gave to millions and the warmth he struggled to give to the woman in the same house, is not something he ever fully documented. He was not a man who invited that kind of examination of himself. The memoir was never written. The confessional interview was never given. He retreated from public life in 1992 and stayed retreated until his death in 2005. And the interior of those 13 years was genuinely private in the way that almost nothing else in his public life had been. But the fourth marriage is the evidence. Alexis Maas chose him at 61 and stayed until his death at 79. She did not leave. Whatever the first three wives found and could not stay with, she found something different, or found the same man at a different moment in his life, when the defenses had lowered enough, and the career was no longer consuming everything, and the specific angry volatility of the drinking years had been set aside. She found a version of Johnny Carson that the first three wives, in the specific timing of their marriages, did not quite get to know. The line about The Tonight Show was honest, as far as it went. But the last word on the marriages belongs to the one that lasted. Alexis Maas stayed. Everything else that needed to be said is in that fact. Alexis Maas, the fourth wife and the one who stayed. Alexis Maas was 29 years old when she met Johnny Carson in 1987. He was 61. The age gap, more than 30 years, was immediately noted and frequently commented upon in the way that such gaps always are, with the specific shorthand that the culture uses to suggest that what is happening is not quite a real relationship. But the people who knew the couple in those years have consistently described the marriage as something more substantive than the cynical narrative invited. She was a former model who had been living in Florida before they met. The circumstances of their introduction were not elaborately documented, which is consistent with the general privacy that characterized the entire fourth marriage. What was documented by the people who observed it from outside and by Carson's own rare public comments was what the marriage produced: a quieter, more genuinely settled version of Johnny Carson than any of the three previous marriages had managed to generate. Something was different in this marriage. This is the observation that emerges from every account of it, from every person who knew Carson in those years, and compared the man in the fourth marriage to the man they had known in the previous three. Producer George Schlatter, who had known Carson for decades and had watched him navigate all four marriages from the vantage point of a close professional friend, described Alexis simply as the real love of Johnny's life. Others who knew them said the same thing in different words, that she was the first of the four women he married with whom he seemed to have figured out something that had eluded him in all the years before. What was different is not entirely easy to explain, because Carson did not explain it publicly, and Alexis has not explained it since. But several things had changed by 1987 that were not true in 1949 or 1963 or 1972. Carson was 61 years old. He had been through 3 marriages and 3 divorces, and had arrived at an age at which the specific urgency and volatility of the career's peak years were beginning to recede. The show that had consumed 30 years of his best energy was approaching its end. He would retire in 1992, 5 years after the 4th marriage began. The alcohol that had driven the most damaging episodes of the first 3 marriages was not the same structural problem in the 4th. He and Alexis lived together in their home in Malibu, in the specific private world of the California coast that was very far from the New York and Burbank studios where the career had been built. He watched tennis. He wrote jokes that he never performed. He kept up with the science and the politics and the cultural life that had always fed the show's preparation, maintaining the habits of a man who was genuinely curious about the world, even after the world no longer had a nightly reason to need his observations about it. He retired from The Tonight Show in May 1992, after 30 years. The final broadcast was extraordinary in the way of things that have been genuinely important for a very long time, and are now ending, emotionally present in ways that the carefully controlled public Carson rarely permitted. A goodbye that was recognized immediately as the conclusion of something irreplaceable. He sat alone at the desk for the last segment, without a guest, and spoke about what the show had meant to him, and what the audience had meant to him, and what it was like to say goodbye to something that had been the center of his professional life for 3 decades. After that night, he became private in a way that was unprecedented for someone of his stature. He gave almost no interviews in the 13 years between his retirement and his death. He attended almost no public events. He declined the honors and the tributes and the career retrospectives that his standing could have commanded. He became, in those years, the specific thing that the career had never quite allowed him to be. A man whose public life was genuinely over, who was living the private life that had always competed with the show for what he had available to give. He developed emphysema, the consequence of decades of cigarette smoking that had been a constant throughout his career. The illness was progressive. The decline was gradual, and then not gradual. Alexis was with him through the illness and through the final months and through his death on January 23rd, 2005, at the age of 79, in the Malibu home they had shared for 18 years. She has remained private since. She inherited his estate alongside his sons, Christopher and Corey. She has not written a book. She has not given the extensive interviews that the previous marriages had eventually generated. She has simply maintained the specific privacy that the 4th marriage had always prioritized. The quality of a life that was genuinely and completely her own, shared with a man who had finally, at 61 years old, figured out how to actually share it. What Carson finally said about it all. The line that gets quoted most often when people discuss Johnny Carson's personal life is the one he offered to People magazine, that if he had given as much to his marriages as he gave to The Tonight Show, he probably would have had a hell of a marriage. It is a good line. It is, like most of Carson's best lines, perfectly constructed. Self-deprecating, honest at the surface level, and protecting something deeper beneath the surface. The line implies that the problem was simply one of divided attention, of the career demanding too much of what the marriage needed. This is true, as far as it goes. The show consumed enormous amounts of what the marriages required. The preparation was relentless. The performance was 5 nights a week. The social obligations that accompanied being the most powerful tastemaker in American entertainment were ongoing and demanding. There was never a moment when the show was not making claims on the time and energy and mental presence that a marriage also needs. But the line doesn't quite go far enough. The show was not the only thing competing with the marriages. The anger was competing with the marriages. The drinking was competing with the marriages. The specific emotional wall that the Great Plains upbringing and the career of public performance had together built around his interior life was competing with the marriages in ways that the line about The Tonight Show does not acknowledge. What the line does is redirect the accounting toward the career, which is the safest place to put it, because the career is something external, something that happened to him, something the industry demanded, something that the world required of him. The drinking and the anger are something internal, something that the line sidesteps with the specific skill of a man who spent his professional life knowing exactly where the line between disclosure and deflection was, and who was very, very good at staying on the right side of it. Carson was not a bad man. The people who knew him longest and best did not describe someone who was malicious or who set out to cause the harm he caused. They described someone who was genuinely warm in the ways the screen showed, and who had genuine difficulty translating that warmth into the consistent, daily, vulnerable intimacy that a marriage requires. The warmth he gave to the audience every night was real. The warmth he struggled to give to the women who shared his life was also real, or at least the intention behind it was. Both things were simultaneously true. Henry Bushkin, Carson's lawyer and close friend for many years, who eventually wrote his own memoir about their relationship, described Carson as someone who was fundamentally alone in a way that was difficult to fully explain, who had built the specific kind of inner isolation that allows a person to be charming and engaging in public while being genuinely difficult to reach in private. Bushkin watched him from closer in than almost anyone else for 20 years and arrived at the conclusion that the emotional wall was not a pose. It was structural. It was the real thing. 3 wives experienced that wall from the inside, and eventually all 3 stopped trying to get through it. The 4th wife arrived when the wall, for whatever combination of age and experience and decision, had come down enough for something genuinely different to be possible. He once said, in a moment of characteristic self-awareness, that he had grown up in a part of the country where you were not supposed to wear your heart on your sleeve, where the expression of feeling was considered a form of weakness, and where the management of your interior life was the price of fitting in. He never stopped paying that price. For 60 years, it was the price of being Johnny Carson, and neither did the women who loved him. The legacy they left behind. The 4 women who married Johnny Carson were each, in their own way, shaped permanently by the experience of a relationship with one of the most public and most private men of the 20th century. Jodie Woolcott outlived him by many years. She was still living as of this writing, one of the few surviving people who knew the Private Carson of the early career years, the man before the fame had fully arrived and the control had fully set. She has maintained the privacy that all the Carson children also maintained. The marriage lasted 14 years and produced 3 sons. It also produced a specific template: a woman managing the household and the children and the moves, while the career was always the primary consideration, that the second and third wives would recognize when they read about it. Joanne Copeland collected her $6,000 monthly alimony for 33 years, from the 1972 divorce until Carson's death in 2005. It was, in its way, the longest continuous financial relationship any of the 4 marriages had produced, a monthly reminder for 3 decades of what the second marriage had been worth in the specific terms that legal settlements apply to human experience. She eventually built her own life, her own private trajectory, away from the world the second marriage had occupied. She was, by the accounts available, not bitter about it. She had described what she experienced with honesty and without embellishment. She had received what the court determined she was owed. She moved forward. The fact that she never remarried, whether by choice or by circumstance, is simply a fact, not a commentary on the marriage that preceded it. Joanna Holland became a Broadway producer and philanthropist after receiving the settlement that became one of the most discussed celebrity divorces of the 1980s. The model, who had met Carson at the 21 Club in 1971, became, in the years after the settlement, someone who used the resources and the freedom it provided to build something of genuine cultural and artistic value. She was not simply the woman who had been married to Johnny Carson. She died in July 2025, having outlived her famous ex-husband by 20 years, having built a life that was her own. Alexis Mars has remained private. She was at his side at the end, through the illness and through the death, in the Malibu home they had shared. She has not written a book. She has not given the extensive interviews that the stories of the previous marriages eventually generated. She has simply been the person who was there, which may be the most honest description of what the fourth and final marriage was. Johnny Carson died on January 23, 2005. The tributes were immediate and enormous. He had been, as those tributes consistently noted, irreplaceable. The specific combination of intelligence and wit and warmth and timing that he had brought to The Tonight Show for 30 years had not been replicated by anyone who followed him. It is unlikely to be. He had also been, as the people who shared his private life consistently noted, genuinely difficult to know. The wall between the public man and the private one was real, and it was high, and it had cost 4 marriages, and whatever the marriages had cost the 4 women inside them. 3 of those women found the wall too high to sustain a life on the other side of. The 4th arrived when the wall had finally, in some essential way, come down enough for something more genuine to take root. He once said that he had grown up in a part of the country where you were not supposed to wear your heart on your sleeve, where the expression of feeling was considered a form of weakness, and where learning to manage your interior life was the price of belonging. He said this with the characteristic lightness that he brought to everything that was actually serious about himself, the deflection wrapped in self-awareness, the acknowledgement that didn't quite become an explanation. He knew what the culture had done to him. He could name it. He could not, in 3 marriages, fully undo it. He never stopped paying that price. For 60 years, it was the price of being Johnny Carson, the price of the warmth the whole world received, the warmth that required the performance that required the distance. And neither did the women who loved him. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.